Hi, so welcome to Middle Eastern Islamic History number 10, First and Second Crusades. The rules are that this is not an academic presentation, it's secular. I'm not religious, even though we're going to be covering some religious topics. It's important to be respectful as we discuss these topics. It's interactive. Please ask questions, give comments, make clarifications. I love interacting. The class will be a 101 and a 201, meaning that we'll cover the basic information as well as more advanced information, and of course, it's being recorded. So today I've decided not to do a quiz because we've been outside of the Middle East for basically a month now, 2 weeks in Andalusia and 2 weeks off. So rather than quiz people on what they probably don't remember from the beginning of September, just sort of talk about some of the things that we've talked about before, right? So we had this Abbasid Caliphate, which started in the year 750. They conquered the Umayyad Caliphate and then instantiated their rule. And they came to power over the incredible amount of territory that the Umayyad Caliphate had under its control. But as we move after the first century of Abbasid rule, we see that Abbasid power really weakens in terms of its terrestrial authority, and it becomes replaced with the rule primarily of the Turkic slave soldiers who took over, right? That's the whole period of the Anarchy of Samarra that we have up here. As that happens, that they lose territorial control, you can begin to see that all of these Persian states, for example, exist in the modern territory of Iran and greater Persia, right? The Buyids, the Samanids, the Saffarids, the Salarids, all of these groups who are Persianate. But also, when we get to North Africa, by the time we get to the year 1000 or around that point, almost all of North Africa has broken off, right? The Idrisids broke off at the end of the 700s, the Aghlabids, the beginning of the 800s, the Rustamids around the same time. The Tulunids had a brief period of quasi-independence, then the Ikhshidids and the Fatimids, such that by about the year 1000, right, we have that map. Basically, the Abbasid Caliphate has been reduced to the city of Baghdad, and it's an ecclesiastical state. We then talked about how the Fatimid Caliphate was unique in history, that it was a Shiite caliphate, right? Because all the other caliphates we've talked about, the Abbasids, the Umayyads, these were all Sunni caliphates. And they were Ismaili, meaning that they believed in 7 imams, right? That 7th imam being Ismail ibn Ja'far, which is why they have the term Ismaili, right? So any questions so far? Anything that is sort of unclear?
We're good.
We're good? Okay. And so after that point, we really saw the Turkish involvement, right? We saw the Seljuks coming from these nomadic tribes in the heartland, first led by Seljuk Bey, then by his children, Toghrul and Chagre Bey. You can see them in the lower right-hand side. And they precipitated a conquest of Baghdad, which the Abbasids were in favor of because the Buyids who controlled them were Shiite as well. But the Seljuks were Sunni. And the Seljuks, after winning the Battle of Manzikert, were able to press into the territory of modern Turkey, right? And we talked about how that happened. One of the things that we mentioned, but it bears further repeating, is that when the Seljuks invaded, it wasn't a unified military structure responding to a central state. It was a bunch of individual tribal confederations that were moving together under the leadership of a great Seljuk. In this case, Alparslan, who you can see in the upper right-hand side, right? He was the one who led the Battle of Manzikert. He's the one who precipitated the majority of Anatolia becoming controlled by the Turks. And in order to deal with the fact that all of these different Turks were coming from different tribes that had no general loyalty to the Great Seljuk, there was a question of would these groups just pillage and burn and take the loot that they had taken and that they had landed on, and therefore prevent a strong, successful empire from being forged, right? So this is the genius of Nizam al-Mulk, who you can see on the left-hand side. His view was primarily that all of these different Turkic tribes should be given iqta, or parcels of land over which they could have control. And this meant that they would at least be nominally loyal to the Great Seljuk, but at the same time, they were actually capable of excising money and wealth from land without hurting the people sitting upon it. And it also meant that they retained a certain degree of independence. And we talked a little bit about this Battle of Manzikert. Manzikert was ironically a battle that the Seljuks didn't want to have to fight. Their primary goal was to deal with the Fatimids, right? Because the Fatimids were Shiite. And part of ensuring the legitimacy of their territories was the defeat of these Shiites. We can see in the battle itself that the Seljuk light cavalry was able to surround the forces of the Eastern Roman Empire, of the Byzantines. And you can see from the picture in the lower right-hand side that Alparslan, when he defeated the king of the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Romanus IV, he famously had him underfoot as a form of humiliation. There's a story that says that Alparslan asked Emperor Romanus IV, what would he do if the positions were reversed? And Romanus IV said, well, I would have you killed. And Alparslan famously said, I give you a worse punishment. I will let you live. And after this point, with his forces severely weakened, all of these tribal confederations were able to move into the heartland of Anatolia. You can see the two maps. The map on the left is from 1072, right after the Battle of Manzikert, when the borders hadn't yet changed. And then you can see the border in 1075. Only 3 years later, you can see all of that advance, and all of that advance is done by these tribal confederations, not by the individuals directly loyal to Alparslan. All right, now you can see this is the height of Seljuk expansion in Anatolia. This is the year 1081, and you can see how close Constantinople is to the border of the Seljuk Sultanate. So this, of course, posed a great deal of danger to the Byzantines in terms of the viability of their empire in the long term. So if we look at what the empire looked like in the year 1090, we have the Seljuk Empire, and the territory that it controlled spanned all of this territory all the way into Persia, right, and all of the Middle East territories. And because they had control of Persia, what ended up happening is the Seljuks imported Persian artisans and governors in order to better run the empire. One of the things that we start noticing as we move towards the year 1100 is that the Seljuk Sultanate actually ends up breaking up. See here that Anatolia is hashed and the rest of the empire is blue, right? This was the first break that the Seljuk Empire was effectively split between the East and the West, where Anatolia was under the control of those Seljuk princes who were able to bring all these different confederations together, at least nominally, and the eastern part was led by those who supported the mainline dynasty, and they were based in Isfahan, in the center of Iran. Despite the fact that the unity didn't hold for that long, the process of using Iranian bureaucrats to standardize the empire existed in Anatolia as well as in the larger Great Seljuk Empire. Okay. Now, if we look at the Great Seljuk Empire from that large scale, it looks like a tremendously powerful, unified entity. If we come a lot closer, we can see two maps. The one on the right gives us a lot more space, but it's from the year 1150, so it's a little bit further ahead than we are now. The map on the left shows us what it's like in 1090. And those colored areas just represent a few of the city-states that existed in the Levant region, right? You can see that that's part of what's now Syria and Lebanon today. And the areas that aren't colored aren't united either. It's just that the ones that are colored are representative of certain Arab clans that also control territory. But you can see how small these territories are and how divided, in truth,
the Seljuk Empire was. You can see that sort of in a larger sense on the right-hand side, where you can see all kinds of emirates and sanjaks and other kind of arabeg that exist in this empire. All right, and this is sort of a zoomed in picture of that. So in terms of the Persian side, we learned that Bakhyaruk was able to consolidate control of the Persian half, and we'll talk more about him in a future lecture when we go down the Persian side. In terms of Palestine, because we need to set that up in terms of what's going to happen with regards to the Crusades, you have in 1071, that same year as the Battle of Manzikert, you have Aziz ibn al-Waq, who unfortunately we don't have a good picture of, but you can see his what his soldiers would have looked like in the upper right-hand side. He fought against the Fatimids to take the territory from them and put it under Seljuk authority, right? Because the Byzantines didn't control Palestine at that time; the Fatimids did. But Aziz was actually strangled in the year 1077. So Malik Shah I, the leader of the Great Seljuk Empire, put his brother Tutush I as emir of Damascus, who controlled the routes in northern Palestine all the way to Jerusalem. Okay. We also mentioned that when you had this Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, right, the Sultanate of Anatolia, we begin to see the use of this word Rum, which is the Seljuk pronunciation of Rome, because to them, Anatolia was the heart of the Roman Empire, right, the Eastern Roman Empire, and they called the Greek Orthodox Rum as well. So now we had this Seljuk Sultanate. It was ruled by Kilij Aslan, who you can see on the left-hand side, and he was famous for bringing the Sipahi, or light cavalry, to bear. And these Sipahi existed all over the Sultanate of Rum. Just to give us a sense of the time period, where we are now is the same time as the Almoravids' invasion of Spain, right? So that's basically where we are on the Andalusian side in terms of where we are now that we're in the Crusades period. So on to the new stuff. So I really want to thank Ralph Chapman for helping me put together these slides and notes. So I have a timeline up here of the different Crusades and of what's going on in Jerusalem. One of the things that is interesting to note is that there are 4 Crusader states, but the 4 Crusader states don't last for the entire time of the Crusades. Edessa, which we're going to talk about, is destroyed before the Second Crusade. The other ones survive until 1291. But it isn't just a crusade against Muslims, right? We have the Baltic Crusades, which were against the pagans of the Baltic region. You have the Albigensian Crusades, which occur in southern France, which are against the Cathars, which is a Christian religious heresy. So you have all of these different religious fervor incidents occurring. It's not just against the Muslims in both Iberia and in the Eastern Mediterranean. So does anybody have any ideas about why there would be such religious fervor at this point in time?
Well, from the Christian side, this was the millennium. People were expected that somewhere around 1000 AD or sometime after that would be the second coming of Christ, and Jerusalem was presumably going to be the site of the second coming of Christ for the Christians. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. That's really interesting. I also have a comment in the chat that the Baltic Crusade led to the creation of the Kingdom of Prussia and later the German Empire. And that's absolutely true. We also see that the creation of the modern Baltic states, Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, really come from, more Estonia and Latvia, come from these creations of the Crusaders.
Now, do we know how religious were they really? Like, to some extent, what happened is in Europe, particularly in 1070 or whatever that was, they were tearing Europe apart, and this was a way of getting rid of the warriors, in a sense. If they conquered Jerusalem, that's great. If the Arabs slaughtered them all, that's actually pretty convenient too.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a bit of that, and we'll get into it. So I just wanted to sort of put down a little bit of what European fears were from the Middle East. The first thing is that they really didn't understand the difference between the Seljuks and the Fatimids and all these different groups. So there were sort of two things happening at the same time. The Fatimids, when they controlled Jerusalem, right? Remember, in 1071, the Seljuks took it from the Fatimids, right? But when the Fatimids had control, the Fatimids had one caliph, al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah. You can see a picture of him on the left-hand side. And he attacked the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and he destroyed it. This was al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah is often called the Nero of the Fatimids, or the Nero of Islam, because of how much religious culture and patrimony he destroyed. He published a number of edicts against both Christians and Jews, requiring them to wear certain clothes, and he destroyed a number of their holy sites, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre among them. So subsequent Fatimid caliphs allowed the Byzantines to rebuild the church, but that memory, the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, really stayed with the Christians of Europe. We also see how close the border was, as we pointed out, between the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome and Constantinople. So the possibility of Turkic entry into Europe was not impossible. We also have the rise of the Akıncı. You can see an Akıncı on the right-hand side. These are Turkish nomadic horsemen, very similar to the Sipahi. The only difference is that the Sipahi are organized and Akıncı are not. So these Akıncı, especially if they were from groups of Turks that were not entirely under the thrall of the Seljuk Sultanate, were preying on travelers and pilgrims. So there was a real fear that Christians would never be able to go to Jerusalem. And combine that with the fact that there were droughts, meteorites, comets, and eclipses that were all occurring around this time. So just to give you a sense, this is what Europe looked like in 1095. And of course, there's a huge schism between the Byzantine Empire and the rest, and the Serbs on one side, and the rest of these states on the other, in that the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church are splitting apart. But at the same time, you have, for example, the conquest of Sicily by the Normans, and you have the wars to liberate Almoravid territory in Spain. So from the papal authority, we sort of have different reasons that they argued that a crusade should be sent. Of course, there was Alexios I Komnenos, emperor of the Byzantines, who beseeched Pope Urban II to send mercenaries, but he was expecting mercenaries like had been sent before, small delegations. He wasn't expecting the 60,000 men that would show up at the gates of Constantinople. But what was Pope Urban's thought process? There are some that say he offered absolution to those who went. He offered a way to heaven and religious martyrdom. He offered a just war theory against the Mohammedans, right? This sort of prejudicial idea. And of course, as Howard pointed out, it offered a way for knights to leave Europe, right? And avoid becoming a dangerous hazard. Because with all of these knights that were gathered in Europe, there could be only one outcome, which was that various lords would use them to fight with each other and cause violence. It would also cause looting and robbery if they could access individuals who were not so well defended. But to send them off to the east, where at worst they would just die, and at best they could reclaim the Holy Land, it seemed like a win-win. The first crusading group that went was the People's Crusade. And it was led by Peter the Hermit. You can see him on the right-hand side. And he started his way in Northern Europe. As he got through the Rhine Valley, there were a number of quasi-massacres, I'm going to call them, against the Jewish communities in the Rhineland Valley. And I say that because in most cases, the Jews would be threatened to the point where they would bribe the Crusaders not to attack them. And then the bribe would work. But we also have in this period cases where the bribing did not work, and you then have actual massacres. So one in particular that's very famous is the massacre of Mainz, which was led by Emico of Leiningen. And in that massacre, We have cases of synagogues being burned with Jews inside of them. We have the entire Jewish community is put to the sword and their valuables are confiscated.
Richard?
Yeah.
Just a brief comment. As you say, the Pope called for the crusade in response, in response to the appeal from the Byzantine emperor. But I think everybody was astonished that his appeal for the crusade just absolutely went viral, and all of a sudden everybody wanted, well, I mean, not everybody, but vast numbers of people wanted to go off onto the crusade. And it very quickly turned from a rescue of Constantinople into a liberation or conquest of Jerusalem. So I think it wasn't just that the Pope called for it and made certain promises. It's that it just really captured the popular imagination, and as you say, many tens of thousands of people just signed up and said, yeah, I want to go to the Holy Land. They weren't pressured into it. They were given various incentives, but it was much bigger than I think anybody expected. Thanks.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In fact, when we talk about
Richard,
go ahead.
Is that the reason what the Raft talk about? Is that the reason you call it the People's Crusade?
Well, the People's Crusade is actually part of the First Crusade, and it's called that as opposed to the Knights or Princes Crusade.
So the first one is the People's Crusade? Or?
I would say that's like 1A, right? 1A is the People's Crusade, 1B is the Knights or Princes Crusade.
So when you say people, you talk about the farmer, commoner, or you talk about?
No, that's exactly right. We're talking about commoners. The People's Crusade was very famous for being incredibly disorganized. It was
so that means like they give up their farm work and abandon their family and they go to fight.
Some of them abandoned their families. Some of them brought their families with them. But yes, that was basically what happened.
So there must be the religious reason for these common people.
I think it depends on the person, right? There were some people who were motivated religiously. There were some people who were motivated in terms of the economic benefit that they could have if they moved with this crusade.
Okay.
Perhaps they could have their own patch of land. Some of them were moved by the thought of war. They wanted to see something that they'd never seen before. But I think we can't discount the religious motivation. I think there was definitely that belief in people like Peter the Hermit and Emico of Leiningen. I think these people were definitely motivated for religious reasons, because why would you massacre Jews if they were willing to give you their valuables if the motivation was money, right? If the motivation is religion and these are the killers of Christ, then that motivation makes sense.
Well, the reason I'm asking this is I always believe in this time in Europe, the common people has no way to change their social status. So is that the reason they provide a way for them to change the social status? So people willing to take risk.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely part of the motivation from an economic perspective, is that they could change their perspective, change their status, and really grow in terms of what the future could hold for them.
Yeah, I think as Richard mentioned, some of them just packed all their belongings into an ox cart and set out. Now, the later Princes and Knights Crusade, the Princes and Knights raised a huge sum of money. In some cases, they sold their land or mortgaged their land. The People's Crusade just pretty much set out, they didn't have any money. They just set out with what they had on their backs. So they had to live off the land. So as Richard said, they would threaten the Jewish communities, because that sort of fit into the idea of a crusade for Christ and the Holy Land. But also they needed money. They didn't have money to live on, to buy food and so on. So they had to get food and money along the way in whatever way they could, as opposed to the Princes and Knights Crusade, where they brought along vast quantities of money to buy what they needed along the way. Thanks.
Absolutely. And in fact, to add to that, while the People's Crusade was going through Hungarian imperial territory and while it was going through Byzantine territory, they actually raided those areas as well. We have attacks on villages that were ostensibly Catholic because the People's Crusade needed the wealth. It wasn't just Jews who were targeted, although Jews got the brunt of it. Belgrade is one of those cities. It was in the comments.
Yeah,
no,
so just to add something, so the question of whether were they doing it for religious reasons or to start a new life or for plunder? Well, all of the above.
yeah, I think that's right. Eventually, the People's Crusade got its way to Constantinople, and the Byzantine Emperor could not help but want to send these people right over into the Turkish way, because he did not want them spending any time in Constantinople. He did not want them raiding or looting or pillaging. And so they marched, and they won a victory actually at Cerigorda, and they kept on marching into the heart of the Seljuk Empire. And so Kilij Arslan sent his general, and the entire People's Crusade was basically slaughtered at the Battle of Sivitov, which you can see a Christian painting up on the left-hand side. The Seljuks would actually not have looked the way that they look in this painting. Of course, this is the European perception of them. They would have been mostly Akıncı, right? These quick-moving horsemen, and they would have been shot by arrows long before they would have seen them. But almost all the people of the People's Crusade, including almost all the people of the People's Crusade were killed, and that basically put an end to the People's Crusade.
Did you say that they won a battle earlier?
They did. They won the Battle of Cerigorda.
Okay, and but they, I mean, did they actually have any kind of military organization?
No. If you see this map here, you see that territory called Danishmend.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, the Danishmend were another Turkic tribe that resisted the Seljuks, right? As we pointed out, right, the Seljuks, when they conquered this territory, couldn't control all the tribes. And so the Danishmend were one that actually completely rejected Seljuk authority. And they were a significantly greater threat to the Seljuk Sultanate than they figured anything coming from the Byzantine Empire would be. So they had a light defense on the western side, and they were focusing all their effort on putting down Danishmend at the time. So the Seljuk force was relatively weak, and the People's Crusade was able to overcome it. But as soon as Cerigorda fell, it became very clear to Kilij Arslan that he actually had to defend his territory. So he sent one of his lead generals away from the Danishmend border to Sivitov, and basically they massacred everybody.
Can you show the picture? Yeah, this picture. Okay, so on the left-hand side, the people wear white. Who are they? Are they the people or the priests?
No, those are the people, right? The painter here is using white as a symbol of purity, right? That these are innocent souls, that they have a pure motivation. And you can see that the Turks are dressed in dark colored armor for exactly the same motif, right? That the Turks are dark, that they're evil, you don't see any of their faces, whereas you see all the faces very clearly of the pious Europeans, right? It's a European painting of the battle, and it's a commemoration. Obviously, you can also look at the architecture, right? The architecture looks like what you would see in Northern Europe, because this was painted in Northern Europe. It does not look like the architecture of Constantinople or any of the cities of Anatolia would have actually looked like.
So the people in the white represent the soul, the people already died? Or that's
No. Those are the people that are going to be killed, right?
They're going to be killed. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Those are the people or the peasants of the Peasants' Crusade. And I guess one of the ideas behind it is, well, they didn't really need military order or weapons and so on. God would make them victorious. God, in his all-powerful ways, would make sure that they beat the infidels.
Well, they must have had some weapons if they were pillaging stuff. That kind of white outfit sort of implies that they're martyrs. And of course, that looks like that's about a 15th century. Is that painting 15th century? Like that's hundreds of years after the fact.
Yeah, I actually don't remember the specifics of when it was painted, but yes, the fact that it'd be painted in the 15th century would make.
Yeah, you can see the guys in armor are actually wearing suits of plates, which didn't exist back in 1090.
Yeah.
Yeah, but look, guys, the guy in the armor, they fight against each other. That's why I got confused, right?
Yeah.
They are fighting to each other. So look, guys, they are two different groups. They are fighting, and is that right?
Yeah, no, there are some people who have armor, but the whole point of the white men with no protection is that they're pure, that they're pious, right?
Okay.
Yeah. It's a 15th century painter. He's painting things he knows about, and he lives in Northern Europe, so he paints Northern European cities. and Northern European armor. And I think the guys in white are martyr, or they're about to become martyrs.
Yeah. In terms, I just want to add from the chat, Jane mentioned that Peter the Hermit actually survived, and he went back to Belgium where he died in 1115. And I also have a question in the comments that about the belief of Prester John. Prester John isn't really from this time period. Prester John was from the period of the Mongols. So that would have been, yeah, closer to the Fourth Crusade than the First Crusade. So we mentioned a little bit about the Jewish massacres. And so you can see this is a map of the major ones. There were a number of minor ones as well. This is a picture of burning Jews. This particular picture concerns the Black Death, where Jews were believed to have caused the Black Death. But the same sort of idea prevails here, in that where you had these Jewish massacres, Jews would be burned alive in order to purge the city of their irreligion and their crime of quote their quote crime of killing Christ.
Rich,
and-
one question. Sorry
Sure.
to interrupt.
Yeah,
Of course, they're easier to burn when they were living in ghettos, right? I mean, the word ghetto came from Italy, right? So they lived in segregated areas in those cities. Would that be a proper statement?
yeah, absolutely. As you pointed out, ghetto was the name of the small area in Cannaregio Venice, where the Jews were required to stay, and that term became appropriated for any such creation. But in Germany, up until the 19th century, Jews lived in ghettos, where they were specifically walled off. Of course, ghettos in Germany operated differently than ghettos in Italy, and ghettos in Germany had a curfew period, but outside of the curfew period, Jews could move outside of the ghetto and work in other areas. So there was a lot of interaction between Jews and Christians, and there were a number of cases where the church tried to step in to protect Jews, especially if we're talking about top-down structure. So the Archbishop of Mainz, for example, tried to, tried to put Jews in the Archbishopric Palace in order to protect them, but the mob overcame the barriers and killed them anyway. But it's not for the lack of these Christian leaders trying to protect the Jewish people in their midst. And just to show again that it's not just Jews who are being targeted, although Jews are the only ones being targeted at this point, you can see the map of the Northern Crusades on the right-hand side, where all of these territories where people had generally not been Christian were conquered by Christians based out of northern Germany and Denmark, and converted.
You mean the Denmark, like Norway, Denmark, this country were not Christian because
Correct.
the Crusade, they changed to Christian?
Exactly. These places were Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were believers in the Viking religion.
Oh, so they are not converted until like 12th century.
Yes, that's correct. In fact, there are
So the
areas.
people still the same, but they converted after the Crusade.
Yes, after the Northern Crusades, exactly. There are some areas of northern Norway and Sweden, especially where the Sami live, where in those areas were not converted until much later, even into the 18th and 19th centuries. But
and one other quick point, Richard, is that the coexistence of their prior Christian beliefs and Christian beliefs created these sort of, I don't want to call it pagan sort of or integrated pagan Christianity, but early on it really was, very, very similar to conversions that went on in Mexico, centuries later.
absolutely. Yeah, syncretism was a huge part of Christianization, especially in this region. I have in the comments points about how Lithuania was the only pagan country to remain so. And they would only be Christianized when they entered into a union with Poland, right? The Grand Duchy of Lithuania with the Kingdom of Poland. And that the Teutonic Knights were instrumental in this crusade, the Northern Crusade. which is absolutely correct. The Teutonic Knights wouldn't be lessened in their power until the Battle of Greenwood, of the Battle of Grunwald. Okay, so now we've seen sort of where the Europeans are mentally and where they're coming from. It's kind of important to see where the Arabs are and other Middle Easterners like the Turks and see where they're coming from. So they sort of called all Europeans at this time French or Franks, right? Because their last clear memory was when Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid received the emissaries of Charlemagne back in the year 809, right? And so they had this sort of idea of all of Europe was the French. The Byzantines they understood as being something different, but they didn't know the specific differences between French or German or Dutch or Polish or Northern Italian. To them, they were just sort of this amorphous blob called French. And it's not as if they hadn't ever seen them before. In the Byzantine military, there were a number of mercenarial groups. In fact, as we discussed, when Ioannes II Komnenos asked for Crusaders to join, asked for help from Pope Urban, he was expecting these mercenaries rather than a whole large movement of Europeans. And one of these groups of mercenaries were the Varangian Guard, who came primarily from what's now Sweden, Finland, and Russia. And so they had that sort of tall build, sallow skin, and were dressed in the way that you can see in the picture in the center, right? So this was sort of the understanding. But I even want to go further than that. Their lack of understanding and knowledge about Europe was such that if we look at literature from the Islamic world, there were questions about why European skin sometimes turned blue. And they figured that the Europeans had a tinge of blue to their skin because the air was so cold, right? So that's the degree of lack of knowledge that they really had about what Europe was like and what to expect from Europeans.
Richard, yeah, just one other comment. The first crusade in particular was predominantly French. I mean, King Richard of England got in later. Some of the Germans were more involved in later crusades. So the first crusade was French, but French sort of in our modern concept of the territory. There was Raymond of Toulouse, there was Geoffrey of Boulogne, there was Godfrey of, most of them came from the territory of what is now France, although it wasn't France at the time. But they were, so in a sense, Franks was not a bad term, a general term for them. Thanks.
It's worth noting, King Richard was Richard Coeur de Lion. He didn't speak English.
Okay.
I'm reinforcing your point here.
Yeah, no, he spoke French, but he was King of England. But that's the Third Crusade. We're definitely not getting there today. So now we begin the Prince's Crusade, the Knights' Crusade. And so Godfrey of Bouillon, who Ralph just mentioned, leads us to the capital of Iznik. Now, Iznik is the city of Nicaea, as we understand it in English. Iznik was the Turkish name for it. And he sets up siege works around the city and manages to overthrow it, right? This becomes a massive victory while the forces sent by Kilij Arslan were perfectly capable of routing the People's Crusade, when the Knights crossed over, it was a completely different story, right? Now, the Knights came later. They unified in Constantinople and were ferried across. But when they were ferried across with one requirement, which is that any territory that they conquered would be given back to the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantines really did not trust the Crusaders to honor this side of the bargain, right? The Byzantines would provide them supplies and travel help and guides, but any territory that the Latin Crusaders conquered would have to go back to the Byzantines. And because the Byzantines didn't trust the Crusaders, they gave the option to the Turks in Iznik to surrender to them as opposed to surrendering to the Crusaders. And since the Seljuks had a history with the Byzantines and understood them, they surrendered to the Byzantines. So even though it was a Crusader success, the Crusaders did not actually get to take the city. And this deepened the enmity between the Crusaders and the Byzantines. They then moved further, the Crusaders, into the territory towards the city of Konya, and Tarsus moving towards the south. And in the area of Doryleum, the forces had separated. You had Bohemond of Taranto, who was leading his forces ahead, and Godfrey of Bouillon, who was leading from the rear. And in the area around Doryleum, the Turkish soldiers completely surround the Crusader army led by Bohemond. And we really see one of the advantages of Crusader armor here, which is that it was so thick that the arrows at a distance really couldn't penetrate. But at the same time, the number of Turks and their position being so far away meant that the Crusaders could only take a defensive position. And so you can see sort of an illustration of that on the left-hand side with the Turks surrounding the Crusaders and the Crusaders in the center. You can also see sort of a more color picture on the right-hand side with the Turks surrounding the Crusaders on all sides and the Crusaders forming a defensive position. This gave Godfrey of Bouillon enough time to encircle the Turkic troops themselves and force Kilich Arslan's forces to flee. Because of this victory at Doryleum, the Crusaders would not have any serious attacks on their forces until they reached the area of Armenian Cilicia. So just to put in perspective the places that we're going to talk about, these are sort of the modern borders with the cities that we're going to be mentioning. So you have the city of Antioch, which is the modern Turkish city of Antakya. You have the city of Aleppo. You have the city of Edessa, which is known in Turkish now as Urfa or Şanlıurfa. Mosul you can see in northern Iraq. Damascus in southern Syria, Tripoli in northern Lebanon. You have Jerusalem, which is in the center of Israel and Palestine. You have Ascalon, as it was called then, which is the Israeli city today of Ashkelon. And then we have cities in Egypt like Damietta, Bilbais, and Al-Qahira, Cairo. But those cities will become more important in subsequent lectures. For the moment, we're staying out of Egypt. But yeah, to sort of put on a map where we are, you can notice that Antioch, Tripoli, Jerusalem are very close to the coast, whereas Edessa is further in, which is something that is important to remember as we move on. So if we're sort of tracing the path, right, we see that when the Crusaders started, they all started, as Ralph said, pretty much around the area of France. Bohemond of Taranto was an exception here. And in fact, Bohemond and the Byzantines had a particularly fractious relationship, even more so than the other Crusader leaders, because Bohemond had spent most of his prior military career fighting against the Byzantine holdings in southern Italy.
And I believe Bohemond, I think he came from southern Italy, but he wasn't. I think he wasn't Italian. I believe he was Norman. The Normans had conquered Sicily and southern Italy, so in a sense they were of French origin.
That's exactly right. Okay. So, and you can see on the map on the right-hand side that once they got to Armenian Cilicia, there was a separation where Baldwin moved further to the east towards Edessa, and the other Crusaders went south to Antioch. Okay, so one of the things that's interesting to find out is that one of the things that we sort of think about Turkey is that it's all Muslim, which was definitely not the case when the Seljuks had first conquered it. And so you had these areas that were majority Christian, and one of them was Edessa, right? Edessa was Armenian majority. It was part of the Seljuk Empire, but it was Armenian majority. And the person who had been put in power was Thoros of Edessa. Thoros was an ethnic Armenian, but he had converted to Greek Orthodoxy in order to appease the Byzantines. Now, he had to deal with paying vassalage to the Muslim leaders. And because he was Greek Orthodox and he paid vassalage, a number of the Armenians really couldn't stand him. And so they asked for Baldwin of Boulogne to come into the city and take it over. Now, he managed to do it with a bit of trickery. He managed to get Baldwin to recognize him as his heir apparent. Thoros of Edessa to recognize Baldwin as his heir apparent. And then Armenians killed Thoros of Edessa. It's unclear whether Baldwin ordered this or this was simply because they already hated him. You can see a painting of that murder in the center of the screen with where the Armenians are the bowmen and Thoros is sort of running away from the castle. But after this, Baldwin was recognized as the first Count of Edessa, and ruled it as the first Crusader state. Now, this is interesting, right? Because we've talked about how the Byzantines made a requirement that any territory conquered from the Turks would be given back to the Byzantines. Baldwin argued that he had no obligation to do this because the territory was given to him as opposed to him fighting for it. And the Armenian clergy seemed to prefer being in Latin hands than being in the hands of the Byzantine Empire, because the Byzantine Empire had repressed their Armenian Christianity, which was a different sect. On the left-hand side, you can see the territory of the County of Edessa, all the way to its greatest expansion in 1131. Okay, so then we talk about those who went south to Antioch. So the city itself was well fortified, and the Crusaders were not even enough to surround the city. There was a very long, prolonged siege, and you can see some of that in the illustration in the center. Of course, this was made by Northern Europeans, so it doesn't illustrate the situation exactly as it was. But eventually, the siege broke, and the reason the siege broke was that Bohemond of Toronto, this leader that we've kept talking about, reached out to some of the leading commanders in Antioch. And one of them was a guard by the name of Firuz. Firuz was an Armenian who had been converted to Islam, and he was a soldier working to protect the city, as I said. It's rumored that a wealthier Turk had seduced his wife, and so he was very angered by this. So he was willing to help the Crusaders out. So he came to an agreement with Bohemond, and Bohemond told the other crusading princes that he claimed Antioch as his because he was the one who made that relationship. While there was some disagreement, especially from Raymond of Toulouse, the other crusaders agreed and allowed Bohemond to lead the invasion of the city, which they took except for the central citadel. However, they felt there was a great fear that they wouldn't be able to withstand the next siege, especially because the Atabeg of Mosul, right, that in northern Iraq, named Kerboga, was putting together a force that would be large enough to break through the walls and take the city back. But the Crusaders found the Holy Lands. You can see this this relic being discovered on the left-hand side. So because they discovered this Holy Lands, this produced a religious fire within the Crusaders, and they sortied from the walls just as Kerboga was making his advance on the city. Now, Kerboga was assembling a coalition from a number of other different Atabeg, a number of these other Turkish local leaders, like Tukak from Aleppo, and Redwan from Damascus. And all of these leaders were not terribly excited about giving all this power to Kerboga. And so when they saw the Crusaders sortying, they decided to withdraw their support from Kerboga, and he fled because he couldn't manage the fight with only a third to half of his soldiers. This meant, and after that point, the citadel in the center of Antioch surrendered, and Antioch became the second Crusader state. One of the things that we discussed is how the Byzantines made an agreement with the crusading leaders, and those crusading leaders would be required to return any territory that they conquered. Accordingly, the Byzantine army was following the crusading army to try and take any of the places that were recovered. So Alexios I Komnenos arrived in Tarsus, and if we go back to the map, you see where it says Mersin on this map. It's on the Turkish border. Like if you look at the word Antioch and you follow the T up, you'll see Mersin. Mersin is actually very close to where the city of Tarsus used to be. Tarsus is not a modern city in Turkey today. So at that point, Alexios I Komnenos was coming down. He was following the Crusader path. He was there. At the same time, there was that siege of Antioch, and as you can see from the location, Antioch is actually very close to Tarsus. Some of the crusading knights felt that the siege of Antioch would not succeed. Right? They were outside of the city for over 8 months, and so some of these crusading knights fled back, and one of those was Stephen, Count of Blois. Stephen met with Alexios when Alexios was in Tarsus. The two of them met in Tarsus. And so Alexios asked him the natural question of, how goes the crusade? And Stephen says, well, I don't think it's going anywhere. I think the Turks are going to take it out. I left before they got destroyed. And so Alexios was like, okay, I guess I'm not going down there.
Now, Alexios was a Byzantine general?
No, emperor.
He was the emperor, okay.
So we've now talked about what's been going on in the north. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the Fatimids. As we discussed a month ago, the Fatimids were a Shiite caliphate, right? So all of the caliphs were proceeding, and eventually we get to the 18th Imam, who was Caliph al-Mustansir Billah. Now, by the time we get this far in the Fatimid Caliphate, the same thing happens that we've seen over and over again, be it the Abbasid Caliphate or the Umayyad Caliphate in Spain. Leading generals begin to take over from the families that begin to be poorer and poorer at administrating. And in the case of Egypt, you have the Al-Jamalis. Now, the Al-Jamalis were also Armenians who were converted to Islam, and they were made into Mamluk, right? These Mamluk, these slave soldiers. So Badr al-Jamali was in power, and he built a number of important places across Egypt. One of the few that survives to the present day is the Al-Juyushi Mosque. You can see it below. You can see what these Armenian Mamluks would have looked like. That's a painting on the left-hand side. And Badr al-Jamali was really the eyes and ears for al-Mustansir Billah. And he was succeeded by his son in the position of Grand Vizier. And that was Al-Afdal Shahanshah. And you can see the picture of him in the circle. Al-Afdal Shahanshah now saw al-Mustansir Billah die, and there was a question as to who would succeed him. There were two sons. One was Nizar ibn Mustansir, and the other was al-Musta'li. Now, al-Musta'li was a young kid, very impressionable, and so Al-Afdal Shahanshah decided that he wanted al-Musta'li to succeed, so that way he could concentrate more power as the Grand Vizier. But the majority of the military did not agree, and neither did the majority of the people. They supported Nizar, who was older and a lot more formidable. And in fact, Nizar was almost successful in taking over Egypt. We have coins like the one in the lower left, showing that Nizar ibn al-Mustansir almost took control of Egypt, and he was printing his own coins while he was in power for the few months that he ruled. Al-Afdal Shahanshah was able to regroup and expel him all the way to Syria and regain power. But this led to a fracturing of the Ismailis. There was one group who would be called Nizari Ismailis, those who followed Nizar, and Musta'li Ismailis, those who followed Al-Afdal Shahanshah's pick of Al-Musta'li as the Fatimid Caliph. Now, the Nizari Ismailis are probably very famous because of their leading general, Hassan al-Sabah. Hassan al-Sabah organized the Nizari Ismailis into the famous group called the Assassins. So the Assassins started building a number of castles in the mountainous areas of Syria and Iran. You can see the map here. They had three major castles in Syria, right? Masyaf, Kahf, and Khawaba. But their most important castle was Alamut in Iran. You can see sort of an imagined vision of Alamut in the center. We don't know exactly what the Nizari Ismailis did when they were in these fortifications, but we have the sort of idea that they took extreme drugs and other mind-altering substances in order to open their mind to the possibility of paradise. And then once they were intoxicated, would be sent to perform acts of assassination against both Muslim and Christian officials who could pose a danger to the Nizari Ismaili order.
They were basically also called Hashashin, right? But it's not because they took hashish.
Well, no. The term Hashishin was given to them because of the hashish, right? The term that we don't know what they called themselves, but the term that we suspect was asasiyun, which means those who believe in the fundamentals, and makes a lot of sense if they think that they're a religious order who's gone to the extreme to find out the truth. But asasiyun also sounds like hashashin. So that term became applied to them by their enemies because they basically called them drunken individuals.
So, Richard, so basically we are talking about the English word assassin is from the word Hasasi Sabat, right?
The word assassin comes from the name of this group. So
what's the name of this group? It's
right.
Hassani.
Well, there are two names, right? We believe that they called themselves Asasiyun. Right? It sounds very similar to that. Yeah, Asasiyun. Their enemies called them Hashashin. But either way, it has that Asasa sound to it, right? Which is where we get assassin from in English.
So what that mean in Arab?
Sure. Asasiyun means those who believe in the fundamentals.
Asasiyon, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Hashashin means those who smoke marijuana, hash.
Oh, so okay. Are they belong to which group in the Islam?
Right. These are Nizari Ismailis, right? If we go back to our massive tree, right, we have the Sunnis and the Shiites and those who are not. But within the Sunnis and the Shiites, then we start having groups, right? Within the Shiites, we've already seen one split. That was the split between the Zaydis, right, the Fivers, and everybody else. Now we got to another point where we have the split between the Seveners and everybody else. So now we've been following these Seveners, these Ismailis. Seveners and Ismailis are the same thing. So we've been following these Seveners, these Ismailis, and they've agreed so far, all the way up to Al-Mansur al-Mustansir Bilha, they've agreed on everybody who's the caliph. But now we have a split, right? Those who follow Nizar are Nizari Ismailis, right? They are the Ismailis who follow Nizar. Those who disagree, who follow Musta'ili, are the Musta'ili Ismailis.
So they are neither Sunni, neither Shia?
They are Shiite.
They are part of Shia. Are they still in today?
Nizari Ismailis still exist. Musta'ili Ismailis no longer exist. There are about 15 million Nizari Ismailis in the world today. Most of them live in either Tajikistan or India.
So does the Hassani, how to call it, the Hassani group still exist today? Or
the assassins themselves don't exist anymore. The assassins were destroyed by Hulagu Khan, specifically because the Mongols couldn't stand them. And so they did everything in their power to just wipe this order off the face of the map.
You're just mentioning them, and you're going to talk about Baldwin and all that stuff?
We're eventually going to get into their geopolitics when it comes to the various wars and campaigns. At the moment, I was just setting them up, right? Because this is the point when Hassan al-Sabah comes into existence. Was the revolt of the Nizaris against Al-Afdal Shahanshah. The real interplay between these three groups really kicks off as we move into the 1100s. So we mentioned that the Seljuks had conquered Jerusalem from the Fatimids in 1071, right? Atsaz ibn Waq, and it had remained under his control and the control of his successors, who were known as the Artukids. You can see Sukmen of the Artukids in the left-hand side. He was the ruler appointed by the Seljuks to rule Jerusalem and the areas around it. And the Fatimids did not want to allow that to happen. They saw the Crusaders coming from the north, and they thought it was a natural alliance, because similarly to how it's difficult for the Christians to parse apart all of the different Muslim groups, the Muslims found it very hard to parse apart all of the Christian groups, and they thought that the Crusaders were a Byzantine mercenarial army. So he thought that if he invaded from the south, they could create a pincer movement and attack the Seljuks together. who were their mutual enemy. So as you can see from the map on the lower right-hand side, al-Afdal sent a military force from Cairo to Jerusalem ahead of the Crusaders in order to take the city. Now, one of the things that we begin to notice with Egyptian troops is that they are ethnically segregated. And it starts in this period and it continues for almost the next 400 years. We'll see African soldiers in the infantry position. You can see the African with the lance. And we have Mamluk, or slave soldiers, primarily from the Caucasus region, who are bought and brought to Egypt in the cavalry position. So you can see they're completely different groups of people, and it was forbidden for the black soldiers to become cavalry. And in the same token, it was considered demeaning for the Mamluk to fight on land and not on horseback. Now, the Fatimids in 1098 were able to successfully defeat the Artuqids and install their own government in Jerusalem, which was led by the man in the lower left-hand side of this slide, Iftikhar ad-Dawla. Basically, pride of the country, that's his name. So the Crusaders, of course, when they heard all these requests for an alliance from the Fatimids, laughed them out of the room because they wanted Jerusalem. They didn't want the Fatimids to have Jerusalem. And so the conquest of Jerusalem began. The Crusaders were incredibly innovative in that they used all of the surrounding material to create 2 siege engines and line them up on the walls of the old city, and were able to overcome it. Iftikhar ad-Dawla had actually taken a number of precautions to try and prevent the Crusaders from coming in. He expelled all the Christians from the city. He poisoned a number of the wells. He cut down a number of trees close to the city, but it didn't matter. The Crusaders were able to gather resources, especially from Genoese boats that had come to resupply the Crusaders. They just took apart the boats and rebuilt them as siege engines. When the Crusaders went through the city, since all the Christians had already been expelled, they just killed everybody they saw, which was almost all Muslims and Jews. You can see sort of the Muslim memory of this event in the lower right-hand side, with Crusaders coming in the night and hacking everybody. And you can see the Christian memory of this event in the upper right-hand side, where the Crusaders are triumphant and victorious, and peace has come down on Jerusalem, even though you can still see the fires in the distance and the dead in the foreground. So by 1099, Jerusalem was in Crusader hands, and Baldwin, the Count of Edessa, claimed the kingship of Jerusalem to be his as well. How do people think that Europe was responding to this? How do you think that people perceived what was going on in terms of these quick strings of victories and the creation of these Crusader states?
The will of God.
One document I remember a long time ago is, I think that it kind of describes the bloody, they kind of like bloodthirst, like kind of, I think they describe how many people they kill, and then that's the one document I remember I read. Very shocking. Kind of like only thing they enjoy is blood.
Yeah, no, that there's definitely that perception. One of the most famous lines is, of course, that horses could not move through Jerusalem without being knee deep in blood, right? After all the people that had been killed. And I would second the point made earlier of that it was the will of God. I think the idea of Deus vult, right, if God wills it, which was a common chant by the people when Pope Urban II inaugurated the crusade. I think that definitely applies here, that God was overseeing their victory.
Did they know about it quickly?
Sorry?
Did they know about it? I mean, did they know about it? Did they know about the victory quickly?
They didn't. The conquest of Jerusalem actually happened before Pope Urban died, but the spread of the news took longer than he had. But I think after about a month, they knew. The information traveled back in about a month. The thing is, the Genoese and yeah, I think it's the Genoese primarily, kept the sea lanes open. In fact, there were numerous fights between the Genoese navy and the Egyptian navy, because the Egyptian navy, especially as we move into the later days of the Fatimids and the early days of the Ayyubids, was incredibly strong. But yeah, word spread because of the Genoese.
Richard, I'd also suggest they probably came away with the belief that it was very easy to just go there and conquer, because the First Crusade is probably the only one that works.
Yeah, that's
I think,
absolutely right.
well, I thought the survival rate in the Crusades was really low, like about 20% of them actually survived the march to Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah. But you have to remember they started with 60,000. So
Yeah,
So
and it wasn't just the
actually-
Arabs killing, it was the lack of food and water.
yeah, no, exactly. No, a lot of the people didn't make it, and the vast majority didn't make it, or they turned away. But the thing is that we talked about how divided the Seljuk Sultanate was, how all these different groups were opposing each other, how they had been weakened by each other, and after the Crusaders took Jerusalem, there was a quick fight over the city of Ascalon in 1099, but the Crusaders won an astounding victory against the Fatimids in Ascalon, which prevented the Egyptians from making another strike against Jerusalem. Additionally, once the Crusaders had established their territory, they built a number of fortresses and fortifications that were beyond anything that the Muslim world had ever seen. There were a lot of advances that the Islamic world had. We talked about them last time with Sergio over Europe, but the construction of fortresses was something in which Europe had excelled to a greater degree than the Islamic world had. And you can see, for example, this is Clef des Chevaliers. This is currently in the border of Lebanon, and is one of over 36 castles that the Crusaders built along the Mediterranean in order to protect their territory. And these castles were very well defended. On the map on the right-hand side, we can sort of see where all of these different Crusader kingdoms were, right? You have the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, which was created after the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, right? We can also see between Antioch and Tripoli, the mountains of Masyaf, where the assassins were primarily based, if we're talking about the Levant region. And we can see that the Byzantine Empire had reconquered all of those territories along the road to Antioch, with the exception of those in Armenia.
Richard, those entities, those other than the Kingdom of Jerusalem, those that were less than kingdoms, I mean, did they owe fealty to some European monarchs? How did that work?
No, they owed fealty to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So the Kingdom of Jerusalem was a primus inter pares, right? A first among equals. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem was responsible for organizing the Crusader States. But the various Crusader states made it quite clear that they were not going to be beholden to any European monarch. And also because of the distance and communications ability, it was very difficult for a European leader to even try to force his authority on these groups.
But they did consider themselves in some sense under the kingdom, the King of Jerusalem.
Yes.
Okay.
So how does the king, they had the king of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, or how does the king come out? Is that
sure? As I mentioned, when Jerusalem was conquered, Baldwin I of Edessa, Count of Edessa, also claims the throne of Jerusalem, and so he becomes King of Jerusalem in addition to his title as Count of Edessa. In the subsequent decades, Edessa comes to have its own independent government, separate from the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but Baldwin I ruled both territories for a few years. He was one of the nobles that led the Prince's Crusade. All of the leaders, the leader of Tripoli, of Antioch, of Edessa, of Jerusalem, these were all Crusader knights. And while the majority of the people who came to settle, because once these Crusader kingdoms were created, there were settlers who would come from Europe to come to this new land. none of them were allowed to be part of the ruling structure. The ruling structure was reserved for the knights.
But what's also interesting is after the Second Crusade, a lot of the people went back. In fact, majority went back because they knew their climate. They knew, they were not used to this climate. And even though there was more territories to grab and, and apply their trade, for some reason they ended up going back because they thought that it was, it was something they knew, and that this is something they didn't know.
Absolutely. No, when we get to the Second Crusade, we're going to talk about that. Absolutely. So during this period, we have Usama ibn Munqıđ. You can see sort of a picture of him in the center. That's from a more recent movie coming out of the Arab world. And Usama ibn Munqıđ was from the Emirate of Damascus, right? Remember, the Arabs are not united at this point. The Turks aren't united. The Muslims exist in numerous different states. And so Damascus is its own small country, city-state. And Usama ibn Munqıđ was the ambassador of the Emirate of Damascus to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And so he wrote about his trips and what he saw in terms of what he understood about Crusader life. And there are some things that he remarked upon as being completely ridiculous or scary, or things that he thought the Crusaders actually did better than Muslims did. So I sort of want to take you into what he saw about the Crusader States, because it's one of the best accounts we have of what the life in the Crusader States was. So one of the things that disturbed him incredibly was European medical procedures. Medicine in the Islamic world was significantly more advanced than anything in Europe. And one of the things that bothered him immensely was when he saw trepanning, the cutting open of the skull to release demons or anything else. And the amount of death that resulted from poor European medical procedures. Another thing that he thought was absolutely bizarre were knights dueling. He believed that the only way you could determine what was right and what was wrong was through an investigation of evidence and a trial with a fair judge. That physical combat had nothing to do with whether somebody was right or somebody was wrong, but Europeans were approaching dueling from the perspective of the winner of the battle is the one with the correct opinion. And he thought that was bizarre.
So Richard, so you say that during is European learn from Arab, from Muslim?
No, this was dueling between Europeans.
Oh, so that's the people in Jerusalem that kind of is look at what the European doing.
Osama is from Damascus, so he's an indigenous person to the Islamic States, but he's in the Kingdom of Jerusalem as an ambassador. So he's seeing how do people in Jerusalem do what people in Jerusalem do. And so he's living in this world that's very mixed, right? You have indigenous Muslim populations that lived in the Crusader states. In fact, most of the Crusader states were still majority Muslim in terms of their population. You have significant Christian populations who are indigenous as well. Syriac Christians, Armenian Christians, Eastern Orthodox Christians, very few Catholics, but there were some. And you have these Latins, right? The people who had come from Europe, who were the minority, but they were the ruling class, right? And so he's living in this environment and he's trying to make sense of the kinds of behaviors that he's seeing from the Europeans, because remember, the Muslim perception of the French, the Muslim perception of these Franks is from 300 years ago, and it doesn't really match what they're seeing today, and it doesn't match what they see on an individual level of how people live their lives, right? So one of the ways that European nobles would resolve a dispute would be to have a duel, and you can see sort of what a duel would look like on the lower left-hand side, right? All the people holding swords and fighting each other. And Usama ibn Munqıđ just looked at that and said, that's bizarre. Like, why would you do that to figure out who is right and who is wrong? That has no correlation to the evidence.
Oh, okay, I got your point. Yeah. Same as we are looking at today. So
yeah, exactly. Could you like it's the same thing of like, you know, person from China comes to America and says, oh, I can't believe Americans do things like that. That's like they walk in their house with their shoes still on. That's absurd. Like you'll get dust everywhere, right? So you have this sort of same mentality, but because Osama wrote all these things down, we really have a sense of what life was like and what the Muslim perception was of these Crusader states. One story that he tells that's particularly funny is in a bathhouse. And in the Islamic world, bathhouses are gender segregated, right? Men will, if either it's the case that a bath is only for men or only for women, but more likely it's the case that the bath is for men, let's say on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and the bath is for women on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, something like that. So you have this ritual of bathing, and as I said, it's gender segregated. So, but the Crusaders don't have this tradition. So we have a case where the bath attendant is scrubbing down a man, and it's a male bath attendant, very similar to what you would see in this picture, right? And the Crusader is being scrubbed down, and everything's fine. And and the Crusader turns around to the bath attendant and says, "Wow, that was so fantastic. Can you do my wife next?" And the bath attendant doesn't know what to say because he's horrified, right? He's going to see a woman naked. That's not his wife, right? It would be a female bath attendant who would wash the wife, and she would do it on a different day. But here was this Crusader who had absolutely no idea what the traditions were, but he has the power. So of course the bath attendant washes the wife as well, trying to avert his eyes as he does so. Right, so you have this sort of funny culture clash. But some of the things that he thought the Crusaders did very well. He thought the Crusaders really organized townships very well in terms of setting up who would be the lord of a certain territory, how the peasants would cultivate food, what the requirements were. That organizational system of fiefs that the nobles had brought from Europe was one that he thought was much better than the class system that existed in the Seljuk Empire. And he also liked the fact that in almost every town, in almost every city, there were both churches and mosques, which provided places for the community to gather. So he had a mixed review, generally negative, but a mixed review of the Crusader states. And the interesting thing is, of course, the Emirate of Damascus was an ally of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. We're going to get into why in a bit. So Osama was writing from the perspective of somebody who was at least nominally friendly to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, even if he thought they were a little barbaric. So during this period, we have the Crusader states actually in a position of incredible power. So Radwan of Aleppo, and you can see how close Aleppo is to the border of the Principality of Antioch. Radwan of Aleppo becomes a vassal of the Principality of Antioch because he wants to maintain his independence from the Seljuks. And one of the things that he's required to do as a vassal of Antioch is to put a cross on the top of the mosque, right? This is a massive act of sacrilege and a hugely demoralizing act in terms of how power is to be settled in the Middle East, right? Islam had been powerful here, and the majority of the people of Aleppo were Muslim. So seeing the cross put at the top of this mosque was incredibly humiliating. And so you have leaders like Ibn al-Khaššab, who you can see in the lower right-hand side, who want to do everything in their power to prevent these kinds of indignities. So he actually goes to Baghdad to ask for the caliph, the Abbasid caliph, right, to provide some kind of legal or moral or religious support to stop these kinds of activities. I'm actually curious, what do you think was going through Bohemond of Taranto's head when he ordered Radwan of Aleppo to put up that cross on the mosque? Do you think he foresaw a large consequence to that? Do you think that he thought it was a cute gimmick? Like what do you think was the thought process?
He was a fairly sophisticated guy. He would have, I mean, he must have felt pretty confident about his military position to do that. Who controlled Aleppo again? Was that controlled by Christians?
No, Aleppo was controlled by Radwan, who had a city-state. Yeah.
Richard, I would suggest probably some level of contempt, Because I just, from what I've read about Bohemia, he was extremely violent, so I see this not as any thought process whatsoever went into this. It's just like he doesn't care.
Yeah, interesting. I have a comment here saying that to show power and that he thought it was funny. But I think all those reasons probably played into it to a certain degree. But regardless of the reason, he provoked the beast. So Ibn al-Khaššab goes and talks to the Caliph. Now the Caliph himself has no military troops, but the Caliph does have a close connection to the Seljuks, the great Seljuk Empire, right? The one that's based in Iran. And so the great Seljuk Empire tells the Emir or Prince of Mosul, right, that city in northern Iraq, and this Emir, Mawdud, you can see him in the lower left-hand side, to gather a Seljuk army and fight against the Crusader States. Mawdud gets the alliance of Tokhtakin, who is the Emir of Damascus. So Tokhtakin was in a very tough spot, right, because he's right on the border of the Crusader States, but he sees that Mawdud has an impressive force, and so the two of them ally together and they fight several battles. The Battle of Astanabra was the most successful battle that they fought against the Crusaders and made it clear that the Crusaders were no longer invincible. This battle was not a clear Muslim victory, it was a partial Muslim victory. But right afterwards, Mawdud was assassinated by an assassin. You can sort of see a picture of that in the upper right-hand side. And after Mawdud was assassinated, the great Seljuk Empire no longer interferes in the Crusader States. So one of the things to realize is that it wasn't just Alexios I Komnenos who was trying to expand the Byzantine Empire to the holdings that the Crusaders had made. He was succeeded, generally speaking, by Ioannes Komnenos, also called John II Komnenos. And you can see a mosaic of him on the left-hand side. He fought throughout the southern area of Turkey and pushed back on a lot of the holdings in central Anatolia from the Seljuks. He was very successful in battle. But when he got to the Crusader states of Antioch and Edessa, who nominally should have supported him, he got a very lukewarm reception. You can see in the picture in the left-hand bottom, the siege of the fortress of Shaizar. The modern fortress of Shaizar still exists. You can see it on the right-hand side. And in 1138, Ioannes Komnenos was besieging this fortress, but his allies in Edessa and Antioch really didn't pay attention. You can see them in the lower right-hand side of the picture, sort of just playing around and not taking the siege seriously. Eventually, the Emir of Shaizar, the Prince of Shaizar, decided to surrender to the Byzantine Empire as a vassal state, but not surrender the fortress or their territory. And after this, John Komnenos ended up dying. So he wasn't able to force the Crusader states to become part of the Byzantine Empire, but the Byzantines now had a direct role and a direct connection to the Crusader states. So we're getting to the Second Crusade. The Emir of Mosul that succeeds Mawdud is named Imad ad-Din Zengi, and you can see a picture of him on the right-hand side. Imad ad-Din had the idea that he was going to unite all of the Adaber that were east of the Crusader states, right? You can see his territory on the map. And the way he did this was by attacking Edessa in 1144. And he took Edessa. He also tried to attack Shaizar, but Shaizar, because of their alliance with Antioch, repelled him. He then turned to Damascus. And Damascus, in order to remain free, became allies with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, right? So this is why, for example, when we mentioned before, Usama ibn Munqıđ was from an allied state, right? He was from the Burid state of Damascus. And you can see Prince Muinuddin Uner, who was the Prince of Damascus. He tried to make peace with Imad ad-Din Zengi by having his daughter marry Imad's son, Nuruddin. But it was only when the Crusaders promised to defend the Burids that Imad ad-Din gave up on his attempt to take Damascus. At that same time, though, Edessa became part of the Zengid state. Just so we have a region check, this is about the same time now as the Almohads are invading the south of Spain, right? The Almohads invade southern Spain in 1146, and Edessa falls in 1144. Now, the fall of Edessa was a huge ground-shaking event in Europe, because for the Europeans, this was a loss of a Crusader state. It showed that the Muslim army was on the move. So a second crusade was declared in 1147. And Louis VII of France and Conrad III of the Holy Roman Empire brought troops down to the Kingdom of Jerusalem to decide what they were going to do about this new Zengid menace. And they decided that they were going to attack Damascus, which is bizarre because Damascus is literally the one Muslim state that was their ally, their clear ally. But when the European groups led by King Louis and Conrad III arrived in the Middle East, they didn't take the actual Crusaders' words in terms of what they should do and where they should focus. They believed that Muslims were indistinguishable from one another. They hadn't learned the lessons the Crusaders had learned, which is that Muslims have internal political divides just as we do. And they besieged Damascus, which meant that the emir of Damascus had to call on Imad ad-Din Zengi and his son Nuruddin Zengi to liberate them from the Crusaders and become part of the Zengid Emirate. So the Second Crusade actually backfired in its attempt. Not only was Damascus not annexed to the Crusader states, but it took their ally off the table and effectively expanded the power of their enemy, the Zengid state. As Zach mentioned before, many of those that came with the Second Crusading Army left as soon as the Second Crusading Army went back to Europe. The conditions in the Middle East, which were something that the Crusaders and some of the earlier settlers had become used to and started to enjoy, were just so alien to them that they didn't see a point in staying. They certainly couldn't understand why the Crusaders allowed so many Muslims to live freely within their territory. So at the end of 1154, so a few more years, Nuruddin, who succeeded his father Imad, was able to unite almost all of the territory east of the Crusader states, including the county of Edessa, which he took. So you can see by this map that now, unlike the variety of separate independent statelets that the Crusaders had been dealing with during the First Crusade, the Crusaders were now dealing with a unified enemy. So,
Richard?
Yeah.
These are still Shia or Sunni?
These are all Sunni.
All Sunni.
Right. The only Shiites in this picture are the Caliphate of Cairo and the Assassins.
Thanks.
So yeah, this is basically where we end, having talked about the First and Second Crusades. Any questions? Any curiosities?
I guess going earlier, why did they choose Baldwin as a king? I mean, he wasn't a, so to speak, an obvious choice. That was to me kind of like weird in that regard.
Yeah, no. The reason that they chose Baldwin was simply that he led the assault. He led the assault on Jerusalem, and yeah, I think that's really it. He also managed to solidify the systems and grant a number of the knights privileges, so it ended up working out. Now, I have a question in the comments that I see a lot of Armenians in southern Turkey. Are they still there today, or were they all killed in the Armenian genocide? It's more the latter than the former. Most of, actually, let me go back a few slides because it's easier to see when you can see the entire map of Turkey. Okay, you can see it here. If you look at the area where Antioch is, you can see that there's this sort of promontory that's south of the northernmost point of the Syrian border, right? That area is called Alexandretta, or Hatay province. Hatay province is the Turkish term for it. Alexandretta is the pro-Syrian term for it. That area became part of Turkey only in 1937, right? It was part of the Ottoman Empire before, but it wasn't part of the Republic of Turkey when Turkey was declared in 1924 until 1937. So in those areas, there are still Armenian populations because those areas, while the genocide was going on, those areas were not directly targeted by the genocide. The genocide typically didn't happen south of that Syrian border region. If we go north of that to where Armenian Cilicia is, almost all of those regions were liquidated, and those Armenians were forced to march to what is now Lebanon and Syria.
That's the most saddest. I mean, what did Hitler say? When
Nobody remembers the Armenians.
Nobody
Yeah.
remembers the Armenians. Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't as large when the genocide took place as a percentage. I mean, as it was during this period. The Armenian population, the bulk of it, during the the early 20th century, was concentrated in areas a little bit to the northwest, close to Constantinople, and in the far east of Turkey. Like you can see on this map, if you look north of Al-Hasaka, you can see the area that's labeled Midyat. From Midyat over, almost all of those areas had large Armenian populations. We're talking about in excess of 20% of the population of those areas. Sometimes they were even majorities of certain cities. Those areas today, of course, are Kurdish majority because the Armenians were expelled, and so the Kurds became the largest population there. All right.
Any other questions or?
Yeah.
If you guys want, we can look at Jushi Mosque and a couple of items on Google Earth for a sec, if you guys want. It's up to you. Anybody down to look at, real time?
I am.
Okay, good. Let's do it. Google Earth it is. All right. So.
Great job as usual, Richard.
No, Richard.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Yeah, this is great.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
All right, so I'll stop sharing.
Yep. Stop. Yeah, and I'll just let me go to Google Earth right now. And then I'll share that. And then Rich, if you want to direct me, I'm all ears.
Yeah. This is okay. Let me see.
So what I want to do is I want to do a couple of sites that you mentioned. So because it's interesting to also show people how it looks now, and then maybe,
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Well, actually, let's do the old city of Jerusalem because
what happened? Are you sharing or it's me sharing?
it's you sharing. I don't do Google Earth. I don't know how to do it.
We're viewing Zach's screen.
Yeah.
You're viewing my screen? For some reason I'm okay.
Yeah, it says you're screen sharing, but we don't see anything.
Oh, okay. I apologize. 1 second. Here you go. You see Google Earth?
Yeah.
Yep.
Excellent. All right. So let me just move this. So the first one we're going to go to is an Egyptian mosque that Richard had mentioned.
Yeah, so Al-Juyushi.
Yeah, I just want to get the spelling correctly. I wrote it down. So it's G-U-Y-U-Shi, almost a Japanese name. Mosque. There you go. All right.
Wait, what does it say? Juyushi Mosque where?
Egypt.
Oh, in Egypt. Okay. Okay, for a second I thought it said something else. Okay. Yeah, so the Jiyushi Mosque, as I mentioned, was built by Badr al-Jamali, who was this Armenian Mamluk, right? We realized this term Mamluk, this slave soldier, a number of them come from a lot of different ethnicities. So when we say that they're Turkic slave soldiers, some of them are actually not Turks at all. So you have these Armenian Mamluks, and they are the Grand Viziers of the Fatimid Caliphate. And the irony, of course, is that the Fatimids are Shia, but these Mamluks are actually Sunni. And so when they built their mosques, they built them as Sunni mosques. The Fatimid Caliphate was tolerant of Sunnis at some periods, and at other periods it wasn't. But towards the late Fatimid Caliphate, they were forced to be tolerant of Sunnis, if only because the majority of the Egyptian population was Sunni.
So I'm gonna go right into next to the mosque. Oops, told me no street view. Why there's no street view? 1 second. We were inside the mosque just now, but
Yeah. Is there any way just to zoom in, like just zoom in from top view?
sure.
Yeah, so you can see the mosque is at the edge of the mountain, and you can see the wall of the mountain. You can also see the mosque itself is in the foreground. You can see also in the center, right, we have that green area around a fountain. As we discussed before, green is a symbol of prosperity and life. So you would see that in any mosque. And this is a quintessential piece of Egyptian style architecture from that period, right? We have the rounded domes and the flat roofs otherwise, which is very typical of Egyptian style Islamic architecture from, the 12th century.
So the next one I wanted to go to one of the castles, which is Croc des Chevaliers.
Croc des Chevaliers, yeah.
And then
Yep.
I'm sorry, you saw that?
Yeah. There it is in Syria. Sorry,
Okay.
I thought it.
We have more of a street view. So we're going from Egypt to Syria in a matter of seconds.
Yeah.
All right, and now let's see if there's a street view.
I mean, you can see the excellent positioning of this castle on the mountain. The Crusader States were bordered on the eastern side by the Anti-Lebanon Mountains, which are an incredibly difficult mountain range to pass, one of the tallest mountain ranges in the Middle East, aside from those in Iran. This position on the mountain was incredibly well defended. Croc des Chevaliers, but the key part is that Croc des Chevaliers was among a number of different castles that existed to protect the area.
I just want to show the area a little bit so that people can see and then the third one you just mentioned also, I mean, I forgot the name of it. Hold on a second. Did I write it down or something? The recent one you mentioned, but we can actually go, maybe there's something in Cilicia that Armenian site is left, right? Maybe there is.
I mean, I don't know what to look for in Cilicia.
Temples and how do you spell that? Temples in Cilicia, I guess.
No, it would be Armenian churches.
Armenian church.
Armenian church in Cilicia.
In Cilicia. Here it is. Cilician gates. Just kind of like to show people what. Right. There you go. Oh, here it is. It's traveling. 1 second, guys. All right. What is it doing? It's loading. What is interesting?
No, sorry. The Cilician Gates. Sorry, yeah, the Cilician Gates is a mountain pass. One of the things that we were talking about earlier is that, or maybe we didn't mention it, is that Tarsus the city of Tarsus is in the Taurus Mountains, which form the southern part of that area of Turkey, which is incredibly mountainous and difficult to cross. So the Crusaders had to go a certain route in order to get there, and they passed through a number of these kinds of passes in order to get there. So yeah, these are the Cilician Gates, which is one of the mountain pass entries to the south center area of what's now Turkey today, the part that borders Syria.
Yeah, like just go there just to see. It's interesting. A lot of the Armenians, when they were escaping, right, they escaped to Syria. Well,
they didn't escape. Escape is the wrong word. They were driven to Syria, right? I mean, this is something that we're going to talk about when we get to the Armenian genocide eventually. But the Armenians were forced marched to the south. Deir ez-Zor, which is one of the cities in eastern Syria, was the end goal of where the Ottoman soldiers and irregulars wanted to march them to, because the thought was that they would die in the desert, because Deir ez-Zor is in the middle of the desert. So there were a number of areas where Armenians lived within the Ottoman Empire where they were not directly targeted for genocide, and it's one of the many quote excuses that Turkish officials make today that it wasn't a genocide because it wasn't uniform throughout the Ottoman Empire. But that to me doesn't say anything. That it's extermination in whole or in part.
Correct. They were hacking away at them as they were going. Yeah. So just like an area of Cilician Gates and stuff. Anybody want to see anything else? Let me know.
Can we see the old city from the top?
Sure. Let me just unzoom it a little bit. Oh, how is it? Left. You're talking about
the old city of Jerusalem.
Oh, the old city of Jerusalem. Okay, got you. All right. 1 second. It's loading. My computer is super slow today. I apologize. Okay, and this is Apple. 1 second. What is going on? Oh, here it is. So we'll just say Old City of Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
1 second. Just Old City.
Does this go in the fridge or you keep it not in the fridge with the other?
You can just, it doesn't have to be in the fridge. It's just oil and
I'll
vinegar.
put it with the other oil.
Yeah.
and then
Just color it. I'll cover it. Close it.
All right, we're going to Jerusalem now. You just want bird's view or?
Yeah.
Okay. It's loading.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just trying to get my bearings. Okay, so we are looking. Yeah. Okay, the top of this picture is west, right? So, okay, now we're rotating again.
I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
Top of this picture is west. Right side of this picture is okay.
It's loading. That's why I apologize.
Okay, I guess it's trying to orient towards south being at the bottom. Okay, so we can see in the city that the old city is actually made of sort of two major components, right? You have the city itself, and then there's that sort of rectangular block in the southeast of the city, where you have the Dome of the Rock and the surrounding promenade.
Right? It's still in Egypt. 1 second. Let me just pull up the. I don't know what's going on. It's a name of its own. It's still in Egypt for some reason. I already typed.
No. This is this old city of Jerusalem. I can recognize it from the air.
Oh, okay.
No, we're in the right place. It's just the city keeps rotating, so it's kind of hard for me to help people get their bearings. Okay. All right. Do you see where in the foreground closest to us, which is now the northern side of the city, you see that there's sort of this blue dot. Now it flipped to the other side.
Sorry. This is horrible. I'm telling you, like, this is just bad.
That's fine.
Sorry. City of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
I don't know. My computer is doing something.
But it doesn't matter. I was just going to show where the siege towers were placed and how the city was breached and all those kinds of things.
I see.
All right. Let's see if it doesn't move anymore. If we look to the right hand, if we look to the right-hand side of the picture, you can see sort of a blue teardrop. That's where the Jaffa Gate is. So a little bit further to the east, closer to us on the picture. That's the area where the main siege tower was built, close to that area that's very grassy. And it was from there that the Crusaders actually broke into Jerusalem and began the massacre. If you look at the second teardrop, which is closer to the southern walls of the city, the second blue teardrop that's close to the southern walls of the city, that's actually very close to where the second siege engine was put up against the walls. Now, because of this, they were able to converge on the heart of the city at night and basically conquer the thing incredibly quickly once they had built those siege engines. But previous attempts to put walls up, to put ladders up to scale the walls, were beaten back down. The walls of the city today are from the time of Suleiman the Magnificent, but the walls were in more or less the same position during the Crusades.
Yep. All right. I guess we'll just stop sharing. And I want to thank you, Richard. This was amazing. Great presentation. Thanks everybody joining us today in the middle of the week. Please
Awesome job.
Yeah. Please join us.
Thank you.
This week or next week, Richard continues on his Middle Eastern. But this week we have Soviet Union versus USA sports rivalry, particularly hockey and basketball. And on Sunday, Sergio is presenting history of sugar and spice. It's called Bitter History. And we have over 200 people that sign up for it. We'll probably have to mute and do the questions. It's in collaboration with Mr. Koppelman from Washington group that he has about 50,000 members. So hopefully we'll be able to handle all of them. So join. If not, see you guys on Tuesday or next weekend or whatnot. And let me know if you guys want to present anything or if you can go on our YouTube channel through omnicar.org and make comments on the videos. Like today's video is going to be posted. Make comments, if you liked it, and what particularly you liked or something like that, or thank Richard, for a presentation, so people know who presented and what he did and stuff like that. Thank you so much, and I hope everybody has a nice evening.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Next week we do Third and Fourth Crusades, so I'll see you then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Good night.
Night.